Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I'm your host, Kyle, and today we are going to be doing a little clarifying on the previous episode, that being about Alexander Pushkin. Today, we are talking about the Decembrist Revolt, Decembrist Uprising, Decembrist Coup, whatever you like to call it. They're called the Decembrists, and they tried to overthrow the government. Pick your favorite. Anyhow, in last week's episode, I told you that Pushkin was kind of caught up in the same political scene as the Decembrists were, and that this kind of tanked his popularity and made him a bit of a social pariah as a lot of people, not the least of which being the Tsar and the Russian police, kind of saw him as a bit of a hazard to the Russian state. So, now we're going to talk about why exactly they might have felt a little bit nervous knowing someone was tied to a group like this. So, to start, we need to go back a little bit. So instead of starting in the 1800s when Pushkin was alive and the Decembrists were Decemberizing, we need to go back to the early 1700s. We're starting here in the year 1703. This is the year that Peter the Great founds the great city of St. Petersburg. I always have to note that Peter the Great supposedly did not name it after himself, but rather after St. Peter. To me, methinks the lady doth protest too much, if you catch my meaning. Anyhow, when Peter set out to build his city upon a frozen swamp, he intended to recreate Russia in the image of those more modern, powerful, and influential Western European states. Think France and the UK. This started somewhat of a trend in Russia, one that was not always super popular. This was a trend towards reform. Now, this reform raised its head in a number of ways. These might be reforms on the way the bureaucracy worked, or reforms on the military, reforms on economic stuff, or even religious reforms. And when Peter did this, he more or less set the bar for what a good czar was. He kind of went about reforming all of those things, which is why he kind of got to be called the Great. But anyhow, a good czar was a dude who pushed Russia to be its best version of itself. Whatever that means to you, the czar, I guess, in this scenario. Anyhow, but not every czar knew how to do that, and neither were they always interested in that or had the political and or personal gumption to do something like that. The only one who was really able to pull it off other than Peter really at kind of this great degree would be the only other czar called the Great, that being Catherine. But no matter what any individual czar may have believed, wanted, or was able to do, there were certain general ground rules for reform. 1. The Tsar never gives up power. The Tsar might be able to empower certain authorities, or whatever, but the Tsar never, and I mean fucking never, yields power to anyone. And 2. The serfs stay serfs, no matter what. But in his attempts to make Russia a little bit more Western, and a little bit more progressive and forward-thinking, Peter invited something else into his country that he had not really been counting on. That being Western European worldviews and ideals. Peter pioneered programs in which the Russian government, people like, civil servants and military folk, would go and visit the rest of Europe and learn Western European methods of everything from math and science to architecture to shooting people real good. But when these people returned, they not only brought back with them their school learning, but also the ideas that they picked up from their Western counterparts. At this time, this didn't really seep all too far into Russian society, high Russian society that is, but it did open Russians to the rest of Europe. Now, all of a sudden in the early and mid-1700s, Russians are going to Western Europe in numbers that hadn't really happened before. People were being sent to Europe as part of a diplomatic mission or for military training, or a lot of them were just visiting, and a lot of times they were visiting the people who'd been sent on diplomatic missions or for military training, but a lot of people were going there. And as such, the Russian upper crust started to get a taste of Western Europe, and they were really digging it hard. So people, more and more, started to just go to Western Europe, just for the hell of it. Like, why not? As it turns out, the world doesn't start at the Volga and end at the North Sea. There's a whole world out there that isn't Siberia. Who'da thunk? But enough of the rank and file aristocracy. we need to get back to the Tsar for a second. As I was saying before, not every Tsar had the skill, vigor, or vision of Peter. So a lot of the reforms that Peter instituted were not able to really kind of be kept up by everyone. Not every Tsar, as it turns out, can be an amazing reformer who's remembered forever by everyone always. This lack of constant drive forwards, coupled with the whole serfdom thing, to create a society, economy, and overall system that was not what you'd call flexible. As the 1700s turned into the 1800s, a lot of countries in Western Europe started to industrialize, while Russia was kind of having some serious problems with this. While the rest of Europe was having a real banger of a time churning poor people into massive profits under the brand new fancy schmancy thing called capitalism, the Russian feudal system was really struggling hard to keep up. The main issue that they were running into was that the wealthy landowners were not particularly interested in changing anything. The aristocracy was making absolute killing making all this wheat and other kind of agricultural shit, and ultimately they weren't super interested in things like industrialization. And unlike the rest of Europe, that was slowly seeing the creation of a middle class between the peasants and the aristocracy, Russian society was just as stiff as ever. Without a mobile middle class, as much as one existed anywhere at the time, industrialization was really hard to pull off. There was no one really to make or buy industrial goods, since most of the serfs were being put to work on farms and had about as much money as, well, you might expect. This became somewhat of a sticking point for some of the more progressive-minded, future-facing people within the Russian government and Russian high society. But these concerns would have to be put on the back burner for now, because there's absolutely zero time to be considering things like this when one Mr. Napoleon is on the scene. In a very yada 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 version of events, Napoleon shows up, Russia ends up fighting him. In the end, Russia is on the winning side of years of conflict that fucked up Europe like nobody's business. And once again, the Russians are going en masse into Western Europe. They are headed to France in particular, both following Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, and ultimately to occupy France once the war was over. And this time, things were going to be a smidge different. You see, when Russians went into Western Europe the first time, they found a Europe that was more or less kind of societally like what they were used to. There were certainly some differences, but, there were peasants and kings and queens, and it was all very much so very similar to what they were familiar with. Sure, the peasants were freer at that time, and weren't necessarily property of either the government or some rich asshole, but there was a pretty clear peasant-everyone else split. When they came into the rest of Europe this time, the Russians saw some shit that really rocked their world. One, they saw the way foreign officers treated the peasantry of their respective nations' militaries, which was much better than what the Russians were used to seeing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to say that, these other kind of peasant soldiers were treated wonderfully, but compared to the constant whippings, beatings, and executions of the Russian military, yeah, they were, kind of nice to them. Two, they saw this slowly congealing middle class. The Russians were running into people who were living kind of in between the desperate poverty of the peasants and the incalculable godlike wealth of the aristocracy. And some of these Russian folks realized how important that this middle class was for the economies of the nations that they were seeing and hanging out in. And lastly, third, the Russians encountered Enlightenment thinking at scale. Russia had experience with Enlightenment thinking already. They weren't exactly totally shut off from the rest of the world, but this was the first time that it was really coming to the masses. Or, well, the masses of the aristocracy, if there is such a thing. Basically, Russian officers were coming into the rest of Europe, learning about some of the ideals that were being thrown around during the French Revolution, and were seeing different modes of economic and social structure, and they were saying, hey, this all sounds pretty fucking rad, why don't we do that at home? Well, the reason they didn't do that at home was they were returning to the victorious Russian Empire, who just saw what happens when you let French revolutionary ideas run amok. They just spent a whole lot of years, money, and people fighting people who had ideas like what they're talking about, and boy howdy, the folks at home are not super keen on a lot of this kind of progressive liberal nonsense. But that was in a way something of a new development. Before the war, and even during the war, there was some serious hope that Russia might kind of do some course corrections on the fly and try to veer itself into kind of a path that the rest of Europe was taking. This, as always, had a lot to do with the Tsar. In 1801, Alexander I would be crowned Tsar, and a lot of people had a lot of hopes for Alexander. He was suave, confident, and an attractive and smart man. His grandmother was Catherine the Great, and she kind of trained him up to carry on her legacy. And, well, she made the Russian aristocracy very rich and powerful and happy, so everyone was super hyped to see what Alexander was going to do. But then when he took the scene, he kind of really fumbled the ball. But not quite yet. That will take a little bit of time. At first, he was kind of just another czar who wanted to be the new Peter the Great, which was, the vogue thing to do. He especially felt this way when Napoleon kicked Russia's ass in 1805. Much like the loss in the Crimean War that would spur the next Tsar Alexander II, to reform the country, this humiliating loss at the hands of the French sent Alexander I to the drawing board to figure out what needed to be done to kind of right the Russian ship. And, like any good leader, this involved Alexander basically pawning off the task to someone else entirely. This someone else would be a man named Mikhail Speransky. In 1809, Alexander made Speransky the Assistant Minister of Justice, with the idea that Speransky would then change up the legal structure of the Russian Empire and get it on a more modern European footing. And Speransky would do, or try to do, just that. Speransky went off to the Reformation Chamber and started concocting some reforms. Not long after he came back to the Tsar with his plan, Speransky wanted to institute some checks and balances. In particular, he wanted to create some separate powers from the Tsar, and he would give some of these powers a little bit to the legislature and the court. This focused a lot on freeing up the Tsar himself from having to weigh in on everything and get bogged down. And incredibly surprisingly, Alexander agreed, even though this would have been seen as a pretty serious attack on the power of the Tsar, even if it still left the Tsar at the top of the hierarchy. So, Speransky started writing up some laws for the government to operate on. This set of laws was incredibly European, in the sense that almost all of it was taken directly from the French Code Napoleon. I mean, as old Jack Burton likes to say, if you can't beat 'em, steal their legal code. In 1812, Speransky would bring his plan with all of his laws and reforms and such before the Council of State. And, they fucking hate it. It was apparent to everyone who was familiar with the matter that this was pretty clearly just stolen from the French system. And people were not super into that. It's 1812, and France is the enemy. They had not long ago humiliated the Russians on the battlefield, and no one was really in the mood for any of this French shit. Speransky was soundly mocked for his attempts and was ridiculed as a liberal, upstart, rich kid lunatic. This was only intensified by the ongoing beef that realistically has never ended between Moscow and St. Petersburg. The Moscow crowd, which is generally kind of seen as more traditional, saw Speransky as the personification of everything they hated about the St. Petersburg wealthy liberal elite. The Muscovites feared that Speransky's reforms would pave the way to further and further changes that threatened the Russian culture and orthodoxy. Most importantly, they were afraid it would threaten the culture of owning people and the orthodoxy of really, really rich people living in very fancy places. As such, Speransky found his reforms being thoroughly trounced, and the Russian government quickly moved on from the talk of reforms as they once again found themselves in the throes of war with their good buddy Napoleon. But this time things would go a lot better. A hell of a lot better. At the same time as a lot of those officers were getting a school of hard knocks look at the rest of the world and were considering how they might want to change Russia when they get back, the Russian government was entrenching in its old traditionalist ways. On the one hand, war is never a great time for people who kind of want to, change things. No one ever really remarks how rights and freedoms flourish under a time of war. And this concern about safety for the state and government kind of permeated the entire European continent for years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, not only did Russia kind of get really traditionalist and not really interested in anything perceivably liberal, but the whole damn European continent got on the nothing changes now, nothing changes ever kind of train. And in no small part, this was because they just got finished fighting Napoleon, who only came to power because of the French Revolution, in which we saw all of the French monarchs murdered, and then France go to war ultimately with like all of Europe. So to say that the rest of the establishment in not just Russia, but all of Europe was not really interested in kind of liberal or progressive or anything that changed anything even the tiniest smidge. The establishment saw in a very short amount of time a lot of shit go really wrong. So the Russian government said, you know what, we kind of rolled the dice on some of these silly little reforms. Alexander tried his hand at them. They didn't work. France went fucking nuclear. We're done. On the other hand, though, Alexander himself was kind of losing it. The young man that so many people looked at with hope and great expectation had kind of fallen apart by this point. As he aged, Alexander became more and more reserved and developed a pretty good temper and started displaying some serious mood swings. As the 18 teens bled into the 1820s, Alexander made it pretty clear he was not really into the whole czar thing anymore, and he spent a lot of time separated from everyone else and spent a lot of that separate time looking for religious and mystical solutions to his problems. Which, I'm really glad that I can say this was the only time this kind of behavior was exhibited in all of Russian czardom. But anyhow, this was the environment that a lot of young officers found themselves returning to from the war. While they were away learning about liberal ideas such as not owning people and, like, checks and balances and shit, the folks at home were battening down the hatches and were getting real good and paranoid. One group that was hit particularly hard upon their return home was the Semenovsky Regiment. The Semenovsky Regiment started off as a personal favorite of Alexander I, and was highly decorated in the Napoleonic Wars and received a lot of credit for being a very skilled and effective regiment. The Semenovsky Regiment was also known as a very regal regiment, as all of the officers were members of the high nobility. But in spite of all of this, it was also a very well-known liberal regiment, something that was basically unheard of in the Russian military. Even before they made it to France, the officers tore down a number of the traditional rules and boundaries that kept the Russian army together. Chief among them was that the officers would actually interact with their soldiers and talk to them and generally treat them like they were real people, and corporal punishment was entirely forbidden in the regiment. This in particular was just absolutely fucking nuts, because just beating the shit out of your soldiers for no good reason was kind of a cornerstone of the Russian military. So, the Semenovsky Regiment returns to Russia as a decorated, lauded, conquering heroes regiment, only to find that their country is in the middle of a culture war, and they just stepped right into the middle of it. In 1820, the general of the Semenovsky Regiment, a man named Yakov Potemkin, was relieved of his command and was replaced by a man named Colonel Schwartz. Not only was this really embarrassing for Potemkin, being replaced by a lower-ranking officer, it was really unpopular within the entire regiment, and it really killed the kind of good vibes that Potemkin and the other officers had cultivated. Schwartz was not what you'd call chill, not in any way whatsoever. As soon as he took over the regiment, he reinstituted the separation of officers and enlisted men, and got really into hitting people with sticks. So, in response to Schwartz being a massive asshole to everyone, the men of the Semenovsky Regiment took action. For the first time in the history of the regiment, some of the men mutinied. Now, I need to just point this out. This is in peacetime. All of these guys here are all veterans, and they did a small little world war together, and up until now, there had been no reported cases of insubordination. This was the very first. In October of 1820, a number of soldiers, I'm not entirely sure how many, but not all of them, not even most of them, lodged a complaint against Schwartz. They pointed out his brutal treatment and said that they would no longer be able to carry on under his abusive treatment. Now, to be fair to Schwartz, he handled this with real tact and poise. Oh, and by that I mean he had the entire company that contained these fairly small number of insubordinate men arrested and locked up in the Peter and Paul Fortress, the Tsar's premier prison for political prisoners. Now, a company is generally a few hundred people. Not even the whole company had come out and criticized Schwartz. But the regiment looked out for their very own and started complaining to Schwartz about what he did and was starting to demand the freedom of their comrades. So, Schwartz once again showed the kind of restraint you would expect from a guy like this. He had the entire regiment arrested. That's over 1,000 people. But hey, I am frankly surprised he didn't get a second regiment in here just to shoot the first one. So, I guess that's good. Instead of the whole execute everyone plan, once Schwartz had arrested everyone, he broke up the regiment and sent the various officers and soldiers to the far reaches of the Russian Empire in order to separate them so that they could never ever talk to each other or do anything like this again. But this ultimately turned out to be somewhat of a mistake on Schwartz's part. Instead of ripping them apart to never talk again, he spread around these young, liberal officers to new far-flung places, where they could then spread their crazy radical ideas of not whipping their soldiers and treating them like, human beings instead of like cattle. As well, the officers of the old regiment continued to stay in touch and only became more and more into their liberal ideas as time went on. And now, I want to take a second to talk about these kinds of liberal ideas here, the ones that are, really crazy, driving people insane. For a modern audience, these probably don't sound particularly nuts. Mostly, what these folks were talking about were things like putting limits on the Tsar's power, maybe having a constitution of some kind, or, something that would say what the government is and isn't allowed to do, and to numerate people's rights. And also, they wanted to abolish serfdom. A lot of this sounds pretty rad, and not like anything way out there as far as kind of radical political platforms go. But that's for today. For the day back then, this violates those two rules I brought up at the beginning of the episode. Those being, you don't fuck with the Tsar's power, and you don't fuck with serfdom. These kinds of liberal ideas were incredibly lock you away forever in a loony bin where you will never see the light of day kind of radical for that time. And were the same kind of radical ideas that got Speransky laughed out of town. But these guys aren't Speransky. They aren't agents of the Tsar on a mission to reform the country. No, instead they're kind of just dudes. They were aristocrats and they certainly were nobles, but they weren't powerful enough to just say this stuff out loud. They don't have the Tsar's backing. And a large number of the liberals hanging around in Russia were military men. And as we saw with the Semenovsky regiment, the military is absolutely in control, and they will do whatever they want to you, however they like, whenever they want. On February 9th, 1816, Alexander Muraviev, Nikita Muraviev, Prince Sergei Trubetskoy, Ivan Yakushkin, and Matvey and Sergei Muraviev Apostol founded the first native Russian secret society, that being the Union of Salvation. This was a secret society focused on discussing liberal politics and trying to change the Russian Empire. This was not just a club for fancy boys to talk politics, this was a club for fancy boys to talk politics and actually do something about it. And fancy boys these were. You probably caught that there was a prince in there. Well, every one of these guys was a member of high nobility. 4 of the 6 of them were officers in the Semenovsky regiment. So, yeah, these are some high caliber dudes, but clearly not high enough that they felt they could just out and out discuss this stuff. But after the Semenovsky regiment was busted up, they did start to spread these ideas a little bit as they went, and while they didn't make any radicals out of a lot of the people they talked to, they did find that some of these folks that they spoke with, other officers and members of the aristocracy, were kind of down at least a little bit with some of the stuff that they were discussing. As such, the Union of Salvation started to grow. It was a secret society, so mind you, this didn't exactly grow quickly, but this growth was happening, and fairly quickly they found themselves staring down a bit of a problem. Enough people had joined that an issue of doctrine had popped up. The issue was over whether or not they wanted to engage, with, let's call it, revolutionary action. This being the use of violence. And the use of violence became a bit of a sticking point for this young secret society. No one was thinking of trying to start some kind of broad, popular uprising, but there was discussion of things like assassinations, coups d'etats, stuff like that. As you might imagine, not everyone was down with immediately throwing this political club in high gear and trying to overthrow the government with force. You see, all of these folks were members of the aristocracy. This means that pretty much all of them were either military officers or public servants. Not only could they be arrested, tortured, exiled, imprisoned, executed, forced to do hard labor, or sent to Siberia, or all of the above, they could, worst of all, be fired. In reality, the fact that they were discussing any of this stuff was more than enough for them to be pretty royally screwed by the government. But there was certainly a difference between the guy who wants to file a motion and the guy who wants to file a shiv and stab the Tsar. As well, a number of the people in the Union of Salvation just had different thoughts on what the best way to effect change was. So, here are the camps. On the peaceful side, you had a lot of self-responsibility type shit. These guys wanted to spread the idea that serfs were people too, and to try and get other landowners to either free their serfs on their own, or at least not, whip them just because they can. These guys believed that with enough aristocratic support, they could leverage the Tsar, and the courts and the Senate to create, some lasting change. Maybe, fingers crossed. But there was one problem. As it turned out, a lot of these aristocrat guys really liked having serfs, and were pretty not on board, not even a little, with this whole not treating the serfs like shit thing. And absolutely, they were most certainly, definitively not interested in letting the serfs go. Remember, the entire Russian economy is based on landowners owning the vast majority of the Russian population and making them do manual labor to pad the pockets of said landowner. The folks in charge were not exactly excited about giving up on not just all of their power, but a huge investment, i.e. the people they owned, and their only way of generating profit, also the people they owned. And this is where Group 2 comes in. Group 2 is simple. They want to use violence to replace the Tsar. Like a coup. Maybe some assassinations or something like that. Real headline-grabbing stuff. As you might imagine, this division was pretty harsh and put a lot of strain on the members of the Union of Salvation. It's really hard to be in an organization when you want to broadly follow the law and be peaceful, but the guy next to you keeps shooting photos of the Tsar and muttering, one day, while he reloads. Not only was this a huge issue for the cohesion of the group, it was a huge issue for the potential survival of the group. This group was really new, like just about a year old when all of this was happening, and they were very small, even for a secret society. So, a giant schism right down the middle wouldn't really help, all those recruitment drives and whatnot. So, in order to try to assuage everyone, these guys actually put their theory into practice. I gotta give them that. They decided they would write up a constitution on what the group was supposed to be about. That would, hopefully, appeal to everyone and make everyone kind of just cool with each other again. So, in 1817, only about a year after being founded, well, that's what they did. The Constitution was written up in a little green book, and the goal was that it would lay out what the organization believed, what was expected from the members, and what activities were and were not allowed to further the organization's goal. But, in reality, this Constitution was much more of a vibe than any kind of law. It mostly boils down to 3 points. 1, they want to end serfdom. 2, they want to limit monarchical power. And 3, they want to completely overhaul the political, cultural, legal, and economic structure of the Russian Empire. But what it did not really lay out very well was the second part of its whole original goal, that being how the members were supposed to achieve the goals that they had laid out. As such, the argument continued to drag on over the issue of violence. But in spite of this infighting, the Union of Salvation effectively rebranded itself as the Union of Welfare, the same one Pushkin was connected to, and started to grow fairly rapidly. In just a few years, the Union of Welfare's member roster was about 200 people. But ultimately, the issue of revolutionary violence did end up splitting the group as more radical members branched off to create their own secret organizations. The two main organizations to come from this split were the Northern and Southern Societies. These groups were never as big as the Union of Welfare, but a number of influential members and a few of the original founding members from the Union of Welfare were the ones to push the branching off issue in the first place, and as such, took with them a lot of the fame and recognition the Union of Welfare needed to just survive. In the end, this really hurt all three organizations, as the Northern and Southern Societies were never going to get a whole lot of rich aristocrats who wanted to do a violent rebellion, and the Union of Welfare lost a lot of cred when the groups broke off. This ultimately meant that the Union of Welfare, which at the time was trying to expand its reach beyond the urban centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg, ended up having a really hard time growing its membership. But while the societies were separate, they did ultimately do quite a bit of coordinating together and kept up communications, as they were all still interested in the same goals, even if they wanted to go about achieving them in different ways. But speaking of those different ways, both sides of the issue agreed on one thing. None of them, I mean none of them, had any interest in turning this into some kind of popular rebellion like what had happened less than a century ago with Pugachev. As such, there were absolutely no attempts by these aristocrats to coordinate with or even tell the peasantry what they were doing. If there was going to be any kind of violence at all, it was going to be gentlemanly violence in which these guys could keep order or do things without everything getting messy. Because remember, while they are discussing violence and they are talking about overthrowing not only the Tsarist government, but also the entire social and economic system of the Russian Empire, these guys aren't really egalitarians. They weren't just interested in freeing the serfs because it was the right thing to do. Nah, these guys went into Western Europe or talked to people who went there or were from Western Europe or whatever, and they took these ideas back with them. And they wanted to turn the Russian Empire into a capitalist state like what they either experienced, heard about, whatever, in Western Europe. They may have been interested in not being slave owners anymore, but instead they wanted to be bosses. So yeah, keep that in mind. Anyhow, these groups more or less just kind of hung out and did things like read theory, poetry, drink, and discuss the news and whatnot, while hiding away from the watchful eye of the police. And they would do this throughout the end of the 18 teens and into the 1820s. But then, pretty rapidly, something changed. Their moment came when on November 19th, 1825, Alexander I died. And actually kind of a neat thing here is there's a certain conspiracy theory that maybe he didn't die. At the end of his life, he was really not into being the Tsar. And there's a theory that maybe he just packed it up and moved to Siberia and said, fuck the lot of ya, and got the hell out of Dodge. But for all intents and purposes, and what is most likely what actually happened, the guy died. The problem wasn't that he was dead, it was that he had no kids. So the crown would go to his brother Constantine. But Constantine didn't want it. Constantine and Alexander had, in 1823, signed a deal. Constantine wanted to marry a non-noble Polish woman and withdrew his claim on the crown. This agreement was done entirely in secret and was sent to the Uspensky Cathedral in Moscow to be held on to until the event of Alexander's death. Well, Alexander is now dead, and people are flocking to Constantine and declaring him the Tsar. On November 27, 1825, only 8 days after Alexander died, the military and state officials in St. Petersburg started taking oaths of allegiance to Constantine. And then, 3 days later, the same thing started in Moscow. This was pretty normal and was to be expected, but there was one problem. Constantine wasn't supposed to be the Tsar. But seemingly, the only people who knew that were Constantine and his now dead brother, Alexander. Constantine had the agreement he and Alexander had made exhumed and told everyone that he was not going to be the Tsar. This was not a particularly popular opinion because, well, he was kind of supposed to be the Tsar, and this is a mess, and apparently I guess nobles fall apart as soon as a single bump in the road comes up. But Constantine stuck by it. He said, no, I made this agreement with my brother, I'm not going to be Tsar. So, the Tsardom was then passed to Constantine and Alexander's other brother, Nikolai. Nikolai had no reason to not be Tsar, so yeah, fuck it, why not? Once Nikolai stepped in to be Tsar, the Decembrists took action. Real quick, a note on the Decembrists. The name Decembrists appears to have been applied to the group of conspirators after the fact, being that they launched their coup in December. Clever, I know. But in reality, the people who made up the Decembrists were a collection of members mostly from the Union of Welfare and the Northern and Southern societies. The Decembrists, for their part, hated Nikolai. They were pretty hyped to see Constantine take power because they thought he was going to be a little more reasonable than Alexander, and certainly a hell of a lot more reasonable than Nikolai. They were really worried that Nikolai was going to be a super tyrant, and that their desires for change would be absolutely impossible without removing him one way or another. So, a group got together in St. Petersburg and worked mostly out of the homes of the Prince Yevgeny Obolensky and the poet Kondraty Rylaev. In these locations, they came up with a plan. The plan was this. They had elected Prince Sergei Trubetskoy to be what they called their military dictator. He would lead an armed insurrection in St. Petersburg. Trubetskoy and his other aristocrat buddies, in all the confusion over who was actually the Tsar, would go and convince some soldiers to march against Nikolai. They would then march into Senate Square, in between the Senate building where the legislature was and the Winter Palace where the Tsar was. And then they would make their demands. They would try to get there early in the morning before the senators had a chance to swear allegiance to Nikolai, so they could stop them and kind of sort of act as a big looming threat outside, so maybe they wouldn't, do that. As well, they would call upon the Tsar to abdicate power and to transfer over the crown back to his brother Constantine. And to back up their point and to really show that they were in charge, a different group of soldiers were supposed to cross the Neva River and seize the Peter and Paul fortress. And now, with Constantine in power, the largest fort in the city and seemingly the Senate and Winter Palace under control of the rebels, the Decembrists were hoping Constantine would grant them their final wishes, that being a constitution enshrining separation of powers and the end of serfdom into law forever. With a plan drawn up, the date of December 14th was chosen to be the day that their coup would begin. This was because December 14th was the day the senators were going to take their oaths. So, the Decembrists got ready as best they could and put their plan into action. Early in the morning on December 14th, 1825, the Decembrists gathered their forces and set off to take their respective objectives. But almost immediately, things did not go to plan. For one thing, the Decembrist forces arrived at Senate Square after the senators had already pledged their allegiance to Nikolai, and that's not so good. And then another issue, Trubetskoy had disappeared. Just about 3,000 soldiers had marched into Senate Square under the leadership of the Decembrists, and the Decembrists didn't have a leader themselves. So the Decembrist leadership, or whatever passed as leadership, dispatched Rylaev, the poet at whose house they'd planned a lot of this shit, to go find Trubetskoy. And then Rylaev never returned. Without a leader, or even the guy looking for the leader, the Decembrist forces just kind of sat there doing nothing, which, if they had had any actual leadership, their coup might have actually worked. The Winter Palace itself, the Tsar, and the rest of the imperial government were caught completely off guard. But since the Decembrists were mostly just sitting there doing nothing, the Tsar and his forces had plenty of time to gather and oppose the rebels. This led to an hours-long standoff as more and more imperial troops flooded into downtown St. Petersburg to oppose the rebels. Quickly, the rebels were incredibly outnumbered. But still, no one did anything. The rebels knew that at this point, there wasn't really anything that they could do, and they weren't going to win this fight, but they also weren't about to back down. While on the Tsar's side, the Tsar was like 2 days into his reign, and was not really stoked about the idea of starting off this new reign by murdering like a few thousand people right outside of his house and outside of the seat of government. So, the two sides continued to just kind of sit there, staring at each other. That is, until the Tsar sent the governor of St. Petersburg, a man named General Mikhail Miloradovich, to try and talk some sense into the rebels and see if they would be willing to put their guns down and hopefully keep this from escalating. Well, the rebels' answer was a resounding no. Miloradovich showed up talking about all this peace and shit, and a Decembrist named Pyotr Kakovsky shot Miloradovich and killed him. And with that, the Tsar said fuck him, and the Tsar's forces opened fire on the rebels. Now, one thing I need to note about this is that no matter how bad you think it is, it was worse. The Tsar's forces didn't just shoot at the rebels, they fired what is known as grape shot, or canister shot. Canister shot works really similar to how a shotgun works. Instead of a single large ball that would normally be shot out of a cannon, canister shot replaced the ball with lots of little cannonballs that spread out in a wide pattern, kind of like a shotgun. Canister shot could be really, really effective if there was a lot of it, if the target was close, and if the enemy soldiers were lined up all nice and neat, as was the common method of marching and fighting at the time. And well, wouldn't you know it, most of the Decembrists were professional military men, so they had their guys in nice, tight formation. Both sides were mostly just chilling before, but they're in a pretty dense urban area, so they're real nice and close, and wouldn't you know it, the Tsar's forces are much, much larger than the Decembrists, so they're packing plenty of cannons. Yeah, the Tsar's forces fired 7 volleys of canister shot at the rebels. Well, technically they fired one over their heads as a warning, but hey, that's still 6 blasts of canister shot into the Decembrist men at point-blank range. As you might imagine, that pretty quickly tanked morale for the Decembrists, and they all got the hell out of Dodge. But wait! You might be wondering about those guys who were attacking the Peter and Paul fortress. Maybe they were doing better. Nah, they pretty much immediately got repelled by the soldiers manning the fortress, and then they got rounded up as well. All in all, pretty bad show on the part of the Decembrists. It was particularly bad when the casualties started to be counted up. Of the roughly 3,000 rebels who came to overthrow the Tsar, over 1,000 of them were killed. In total, 1,271 people were killed. And not all of these people were soldiers. Again, this is downtown St. Petersburg, and they're firing fucking cannons out here. So, a number of those were just innocent bystanders who happened to be nearby. Quickly, the leaders of the Decembrist movement were rounded up by the government, and the government began looking for the other rebels and their sympathizers. But not long after what happened in St. Petersburg, one of said rebels outed himself. This would be Sergei Muravyev-Apostol. A founding member of the Union of Salvation, Sergei had no fucking clue what was going on and just threw some forces together and did himself a little revolutionary sideshow. He rallied his forces in Chernigov and started just kind of marching them around southern Russia and Ukraine looking to fight imperial forces. Well, they sure did find him in the end. And when the imperial forces did find him at the village of Trilesi, they quickly surrounded him and his rebellion was crushed. Over the next few months, the government conducted a thorough investigation into the Decembrists and their sympathizers and affiliates. In total, more than 500 people would be arrested either as members, affiliates, sympathizers, or being one way or another connected to the Decembrists, the Union of Welfare, and the Northern and Southern societies. Of these 500, the vast majority of them were actually pretty quickly released as the government found out they hadn't done anything, and they mostly just agreed with the rebels and weren't really a threat. Only 121 of the original 500 were ultimately charged, but these guys were charged with treason, so that's not something you're just gonna walk away from and get off with some, light community service and a fine or whatever. Speaking of sentencing, 31 of these 121 were sentenced to life sentence expulsion to places like Siberia, where they would spend the rest of their days in exile, sentenced to do forced labor in a penal colony. Which, one, the Soviet Union had gulags, but they certainly didn't come up with that idea on their own. And two, these kinds of penal colonies still exist in Russia today. Neat. And then, a select 5 of that 121 charged with treason were sentenced to death as the leaders of the insurrection. These men would be Pavel Pestel, Kondrat Rylayev, Pyotr Kakhovsky, Sergei Murayev-Apostol, and Mikhail Bestushev. Somehow Sergei Trubetskoy did not end up at the gallows with these guys, even though he was supposed to be the man at the front of the army on the day of the actual revolution. I imagine being a prince probably had something to do with that, because royals just don't seem to get the same kind of punishment as everyone else. But on the morning of July 13th, 1826, on the banks of the Peter and Paul fortress, that most famous imperial Russian prison, the 5 rebels were hanged for their treason against the Tsar and the Russian Empire. With them died the Decembrist cause. At least for now, that is. Although the Decembrists were not victorious, and the fallout of their failure led to the government cracking down real hard on liberals and liberal thought of any kind in the country, the Decembrists still served as an inspiration for rebels, revolutionaries, and dissidents for decades to come. One thing I have tried to do throughout this episode is show that these guys were not, in fact, just concerned citizens who wanted Russia to be better and to free the oppressed. These guys were businessmen who saw their ideas as the way forward for the Russian Empire and for themselves as aristocrats of said empire. But as time went on, their revolution became linked to basically every other major revolutionary movement that would take place in Russia, even with the Bolsheviks claiming inspiration from the Decembrists. While that is a point that many have made a number of arguments for and against, it is hard to ignore the fact that this rebellion did serve as a jumping off point for basically everyone to come afterwards. In particular, this served as an example of what not to do. The Decembrists got surprisingly close to actually overthrowing the Russian government, but that was a really big stroke of dumb luck more than anything else. The Decembrists got there before imperial troops could, and even when their opportunity to strike was right there in front of them, the Decembrists didn't take it. And though to be fair, in reality, this is probably what would have happened to them anyhow, because let's say they had taken the Tsar, they took the Winter Palace. Well, they had 3,000 men against the entire Russian military. Who's to say that the Tsar might not have had his guys come and ended in a shootout just as much as what happened in reality? Anyway, we're speculating, but these guys didn't really have a whole lot going for them. The Decembrist leadership was basically non-existent, and their communication was even less so. No small part of both of these issues was that the rebellion was planned in less than a month. And that time, demands were written up, officers were appointed, plans were made, resources and men were supposed to be collected and distributed, kind of seemingly from nowhere, and then all of this was supposed to be passed along to everyone else so that they could all do the jobs they were supposed to do with the people and supplies that they were supposed to have. In no way were these people ready for their little coup d'etat. They didn't have the time, and at the end of the day, they also lacked the manpower. This was something that later revolutionary movements would come to understand a little bit better. For the Russian government, the aristocracy was more or less its source of power, and even other aristocrats could be disposed of and cast off if they were going against the powers that be. Look at what happened to Pushkin, and he wasn't even directly involved in anything as outrageous as, say, a coup. With that in mind, and also with the understanding that to go against the system was to go against your very power, privilege, and wealth, the aristocracy was not going to lead any kind of top-down revolution. Instead, the revolutionaries of the future would work to foment revolution from the bottom up, which ultimately would work in 1917. As well, not only did the actions and outcomes of the Decembrists inspire Russian revolutionaries, they also served as inspiration for your run-of-the-mill dissenter. One of the neat things about Siberia is it's really, really, really far away from everywhere, everyone, and everything that is at all even vaguely important, powerful, or fully under control of the Russian Empire. Much like how the West in America was a place that people could go to start over and reinvent themselves, Siberia was much the same. Siberia has been, and still is, a dumping ground for the people the Russian government doesn't want to, say, kill or imprison, but also doesn't want just floating around near the levers of power. And much like how prison is the kind of LinkedIn for criminals, Siberia became the LinkedIn for dissidents, revolutionaries, and anyone who was not a fan of the guys in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And now, I'm not saying that the Decembrists started this trend. They did not. Mind you, Pugachev was sent to Siberia for similar reasons in the previous century. But the Decembrists and their Enlightenment ideas on government and society were incredibly influential, and these ideas hung around the area in places like Irkutsk long after the last Decembrist died. And speaking of Irkutsk, there's a really neat statue in Irkutsk that is dedicated to the wives of the Decembrists, with a good portion of those 121 who were charged for treason being sent to Siberia, just not for life necessarily like the 31 who were given life sentences, came their families and their wives who supported the same beliefs and who helped create an environment of dissent against the powers that be in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Also, Irkutsk is on the Angara River, the same one that the Soviet government considered exploding to increase its flow into Lake Baikal. So, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. That spirit of resistance is strong out in Siberia, and again, it didn't start here in the 1800s. But this is a really neat, important part of the formation of the revolutionary minds that would ultimately bring down the Russian Empire. A number of revolutionaries throughout the 19th and 20th centuries would be sent off to Siberia as punishment, only to return later with revolution on the mind. So, there you go. That was the story of the Decembrists. And if you haven't figured out yet, I'm not talking about the band from the early 2000s. In fact, I don't know a whole lot about them or their music. So if that's what you came here looking for, I'm just truly amazed you stuck it out for this long. But nah, for real. Thank you all for listening. I hope you all enjoyed this episode, and I hope you learned something today. If you did enjoy today's episode, or even if you didn't, please do not hesitate to leave me a comment, question, or concern on whatever platform it is that you are listening on, as your feedback helps me make the show better, and engagement with the show makes the algorithm happy, and help spread the show to new folks. If you are interested in keeping up with the show and seeing what I'm working on, then you can follow the show at BTRSPod on Instagram. Also, a little bit of housekeeping. As the year is coming to an end, my schedule is starting to get pretty filled up with holiday shenanigans, and it's starting to become kind of difficult for me to plan out recording, editing, and researching for these episodes. So, for a little while, I'm thinking until the start of next year, I'm going to be returning to my short-lived, every other week publishing schedule. This will let me work on some of my other projects, like getting the podcast website up to date, and will let me focus on doing more research and maybe even reading a few books and doing some research for something that I can do in the future, like maybe a couple series. So, sorry for the inconvenience, but above all else, it is my goal to bring you all well-researched and well-thought-out episodes, and with my schedule being as hectic as it is, I'm not exactly sure I can deliver on that without giving up things like, sleep. So please bear with me for the next 2 months or so as I work to get next year started off on a strong foot and hopefully build up a nice little backlog so I don't have to miss any weeks at all next year. But as always, thank you again for listening. I hope you're having a really wonderful day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.